Friends, in the hours before, let's face it, Kavanaugh's probably going to get um, his seat in the Supreme Court. I'm pretty sure about that. Um, I wanted to go over some things here that I've noticed about Kavanaugh and this whole situation. Now, I want to bring up a phrase that you need to keep in mind throughout the entirety of this video. And the phrase is, whoever controls the narrative controls the world. And here's an article on Medium by Caitlin Johnstone, and this is a very interesting highlight. Keep this in mind throughout the video. The only reason governments operate the way they operate, the only reason money works the way it works, the only reason power exists where it exists, is that we've all agreed to play along with some made-up mental stories about those things that pretend that they are true and real. Just think about that for a second. What prompted this video today is, I've had a growing suspicion that this whole Kavanaugh thing, if you really look into Kavanaugh and Ford, both of them have deep state and swamp connections, CIA. They're on both sides of this. Not that I'm a Trumper, just please don't don't imagine that for a minute. The whole QAnon nonsense and all that. It's crazy, bogus stuff. But there is a little bit of truth to the deep state. I'll get to that in a minute. What prompted this video, and I copy-pasted this text from a Facebook post that somebody had made, and it's an example of how the narrative has been controlled. And let me get into that. But first, I'll read this. In observing the left these past several weeks, it becomes harder to believe they're merely misguided people who mean well. These are individuals who actively choose to embrace mob justice, the abandonment of due process, and the abandonment of the presumption of innocence. No one forced them to make these choices. They did it because of who they are. It stems from their distorted priorities, distorted morals rooted in an unacknowledged selfishness, double standards, and the comfort weak-minded people get from complying with social narratives pushed by the media centers who themselves lean disproportionately to the political left. At some point, it needs to be publicly acknowledged that these people aren't always morally innocent. They make choices and are culpable for their choices. Political beliefs aren't morally neutral decisions like, what's your favorite color? Rather, they're deeply revealing decisions which directly affect other people's lives and thus need to be more than an opportunity to extract social capital by publicly signaling your hatred of rape. Almost no one loves rape. If you aren't a hero for publicly standing against rape, or you aren't a hero for publicly standing against rape, that isn't a courageous stance. You aren't risking anything by taking it. Instead, you're getting a pat on the back by your fellow leftists, elevating your perceived work. What truly takes courage is to stand up against mob justice and be the one who defends the accused. Not because they defend rape, but because the allegation of rape was in and of itself uncorroborated. Yes, leftists, we get it. You don't like rapists. Apparently you don't like the fundamentals of civil society, however. It's 2008, and the modern Democrat Party has embraced the standard of evidence used at the Salem witch trials. That all of its own reveals a lack of character. Now, this statement is completely mental in light of what I'm about to show you. And it exemplifies controlling the narrative and agreeing to play along with some made-up mental stories about those things and pretend that they are true and real. It's obvious to me that this Ford lady has, yes, she has suffered some abuse, and I think that's because of her involvement with MK Ultra. She's embedded in the CIA. There's no doubt about that. She's been abused in some sort. I believe her father was part of the CIA. He might even be part of the whole MK Ultra. If you read a book called Surviving Evil, you'll get to know everything you need to know about MK Ultra, and that's an aside. So let's get into this. What is draining the swamp? First, I want to take a look at Google Trends. Draining the swamp was extremely popular in November 2016. And that's what Trump meant by draining the swamp. He said he would remove all corrupt politicians and outside interests from Washington, D.C. during his tenure on a campaign trail with a hashtag that has become increasingly popular with his voting base. It was increasingly popular. It was incredibly popular for his voting base, the people that get him elected, to chant, drain the swamp. They were behind him. And to an extent, they're still behind him. But the thing is, Trump isn't draining the swamp at all. He's bringing all sorts of swamp critters. I mean, you got this Bolton guy. He was a complete swamp critter. And again, I'm not a Trumper. I mean, I saw this was going to happen anyway because I've been watching these selections for years, and they all do the same thing. This, whatever regime has taken control of the United States, Trump is definitely part of it. So, Trump supporters from across the nation have attached the phrase to varying meetings, from removing corruption and greed in local and federal government to imposing term limits on politicians serving in Congress. That's basically what got Trump elected. Okay? So let's take a look at this. I found this interesting little article and I wanted to highlight. Anyone who expects Brett Kavanaugh or the Supreme Court to make any significant changes, take on the deep state, or pull the plug on the swamp is going to be disappointed. The Supreme Court sits not on Olympics, but squarely in the middle of the swamp. It is important to the swamp denzians because it can shift the balance of power from one faction to the other. These factions are the left and right, but they're factions of the same political force that has been in control of this country at least for 100 years. At least. And it's the left-right paradigm, it's the problem-reaction solution, it's the Hegelian dialectic. You can look at all these things. This is all in play here. It's the left and right wing of the same damn bird. Okay. But not since 1937 has it ever threatened the swamp itself. Back then, Franklin Roosevelt proposed to pack the court with friendly judges if it got in the way of his New Deal. And it quickly fell into line after that. Okay, so you got to think of this. But we're going to also keep in mind, whoever controls the narrative controls the world. We're going to keep that in mind. We're going to keep this in mind. So, here's a few more highlights about Kavanaugh. He's a long veteran of the D.C. circuit. He worked with both Bushes, worked with Ken Starr, and basically has been a D.C. insider his whole life. He is the swamp. He's part of the swamp. He's a swamp critter, guys. This makes him bad for people who thought the Donald would drain the swamp. See, they're saying right now. The second part, curtail Roe versus Wade. Actually, Kavanaugh has stated that he would uphold Roe versus Wade if he got his butt in a SCOTUS seat. Basically, he's not anti-abortion like the evangelicals want him to be. This statement here I highlighted in red. It's not very correct. I'm going to have all these links below so you can look into this yourself. Basically, another thing about him was, this is bad for both sides. Hobby Lobby has a compelling interest in maintaining access to contraception for employees of religious organizations. That's basically him saying that Hobby Lobby should provide access to contraception, even if it goes against their religious beliefs. On the other hand, religious organizations are unduly burdened by even the most modest of notification procedures to allow this happen. They're stating here this makes him bad for people who want contraception and bad for people who don't want their other people to have contraception. He's like a fencer on this issue. I don't think I have anything else highlighted. This one's okay. I'll still include the link. Another link that I got is titled 2015 essay opinion indicates Kavanaugh is a threat to the Fourth Amendment. Okay, now here's what a lot of people on the left don't understand about a large portion of Trump's base. A large portion of Trump's base are either constitutionalists or they're people that are politically awakened to the deep state undermining liberty. Okay. And this is part of the corruption that Trump promised to drain out of Washington, like draining a swamp. As draining a swamp gets rid of the mosquitoes, the bloodsuckers, the rot. So there's a little paragraph on here that I want to highlight. The part of Kavanaugh's record causing Amesh's concern occurred in 2015 case where Kavanaugh wrote an opinion stating NSA warrantless electronic spying is legal. In his 2-page opinion, Kavanaugh expressed his belief that, quote, the government's collection of telephony metadata from a third party, such as a telecommunications service provider, is not considered a search under the Fourth Amendment. He further stated that even if it did constitute a search, the NSA program was constitutional because their actions weren't unreasonable and therefore weren't subject to the Fourth Amendment. How ridiculous is that? So that basically what he's justifying is since you consent to data collection by telecommunication companies or even like Facebook or Google, that means that since you consent to that, it's the government's right to take from those third parties any information they see fit, and it won't be a violation. It's a big, stupid loophole to the Fourth Amendment. And this guy is going in the Supreme Court. Congratulations, guys, because the narrative has changed. The narrative has changed from all of this to this ridiculous kangaroo court thing that's going on. It has galvanized the right and a lot of centrists behind Kavanaugh, and it has galvanized the left against Kavanaugh, but it completely changed the narrative away from this. Completely. Here's another one. Kavanaugh offered 2 principal explanations for why he considered the program to be constitutional. First, he invoked what's known as the third-party doctrine, which says that if you voluntarily that if you voluntarily share private information with a third party, you no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that information. Let that sink in. The government's collection of telephony metadata from a third party, such as a telecommunications service provider, is not considered a search under the Fourth Amendment. But even if bulk collection of telephony metadata constitutes a search, he continues, turning to his second justification, bars only unreasonable searches and seizures, and the government's metadata collection program readily counts as reasonable. Okay, here's another one. Fourth Amendment rights. His opinion on Fourth Amendment rights here. In 2010, he dissented from a D.C. Circuit's decision not to rehear a case in which a 3-judge panel had ruled that police violated a suspected drug dealer's Fourth Amendment rights when they tracked his movements for a month by attaching a GPS device to his car without a warrant. Kavanaugh rejected the idea that the tracking constituted a search because of the quality and quantity of the information it collected. Although he anticipated the argument that ultimately persuaded a majority of the Supreme Court that the physical intrusion required to plant the tracking device amounted to a search. That rationale would not support evoking the Fourth Amendment in cases where information is collected without trespassing on someone's physical property, such as when police use cell phone location records to figure out where a suspect was at particular times on particular dates. Last month, the Supreme Court ruled that looking at such data is a search, meaning it generally requires a warrant. Kavanaugh also dissented on a 2008 case involving a man named Paul Askew, who was stopped by D.C. police because his clothing was similar to an armed robber's. The cops patted Askew down for weapons, as permitted under the 1968 Supreme Court ruling in Terry v. Ohio, but found nothing. Later on, however, they unzipped his coat, supposedly to facilitate an eyewitness identification, and found a gun. The D.C. Circuit concluded that police went too far when they unzipped Askew's coat, and that the gun, for which became the basis for a weapons charge, should not have been admitted as evidence against him because it was a product of an illegal search. Kavanaugh disagreed, saying that unzipping the coat would be as justified as an objectively reasonable protective step to ensure officer safety. Here's another one. I wanted to share this video with you because it kind of gets into this whole, what was it called? Vince Foster thing back in 1993. And if you haven't looked into this subject, I'm going to include links. This is the most distressing part of the Kavanaugh situation. So let me just go ahead and play this real quick.
Kavanaugh, Clinton, and Foster. And what does it mean for America today? Brett Kavanaugh is a fixer. And as I sat down and I began to talk to people in the aftermath of Kavanaugh's nomination, which I was completely outraged when I looked into his background and some of his judicial decisions, as well as his background, we have established the fact, and so have many people on the net, in the independent media as well, they've established the fact that Kavanaugh was a fixer for Clinton with regard to Vince Foster. He came in midstream in that investigation / cover-up. I mean, the man committed suicide and shot himself in the head using the non-dominant hand, and his glasses were still attached to his head in reading position when he was discovered by a member of the park police. It was ridiculous. I mean, no one. I mean, I heard mainstream media accounts on Ted Koppel that he tried to challenge and couldn't, that said that Foster did not commit suicide. Mainstream media. Guy out of the LA Times, guy out of the San Jose Mercury News. And I remember watching this on television at the time when I used to think mainstream media wasn't that bad, because this happened, 25 years ago. So we take a look at Kavanaugh then. He was brought in as a fixer.
So I'm going to include all these links. There's his wife's connection to the Bushes. Obviously, he's connected to the Clintons in some way regarding this Vincent Foster fiasco that happened in the 90s. A little bit about the Vince Foster thing. It's related to the Presidential Trust. It's basically a trust that any elected president needs to put their family wealth in a trust. I don't know that much about it, but Vince Foster, he took, there was like a delay in it. Um, and somehow, he was about to resign, and he was about to expose some crookedry um, regarding the presidential trust delay, and so he ends up dead. I'll let you look into that. I'm gonna provide plenty of links for you to look through this, but I just don't want this derailing what I'm talking about in this video today. Here's another one. Deep State's pick for the Supreme Court. I mean, this is from July 5th, 2008. And, and then a month later, a month after this, to the day, well, just about, 31 days later, Alex Jones, the InfoWars right here, gets banned from a bunch of social media because Alex Jones probably would have, started speaking up. He might have. I don't watch Alex Jones, but it's like when Trump bombed Syria. He took issue to that. He flipped out. He condemned Bush, or not Bush. He condemned Trump for bombing Syria. And so it's my guess that Alex Jones getting banned is part of this whole controlled narrative, but that's just a suspicion. Anyway, there's the ban. The 6-month late blind trust, I'm going to throw this in here about the presidential blind trust. Here's another link I'm going to throw in so you can research the death of Vincent Foster. Brett Kavanaugh was Deep State's point man for Vince Foster murder cover-up. And here's the 60-minute deception, where you can learn a little bit more about the Vince Foster cover-up and how the media helps with that. And I want you to keep in mind here, that quote that I read from a Facebook post. This whole quote is the narrative that the left are out of control, quote unquote, out of control, when they don't go with due process and blah. This is a created narrative to get this guy in office, or to get this guy in the Supreme Court. Because without this narrative, this rape narrative, all of this stuff in Kavanaugh's history would have come front and center. And it's truly brilliant. It just astounds me how brilliant. And this is the thing about Trump. A lot of people don't understand Trump in this sense, as he's very good at controlling the narrative. He's very good. And what I mean by that is, when he was first running for office, he said the most ridiculous things. The most ridiculous things he could. Get the camera on him. Get the attention on him. And then he started changing his own narrative very slowly. I mean, if you look at him, there was a video by Charisma on Demand on this subject, and I'll include that link. He explains it completely, and he says this is why I think Trump's going to get elected. And this is before the 2016 election, and he was right. He was absolutely right, and I want to show you that video. And that's just another example of this crazy bullshit narrative that they thrust down everybody's throat about this rape thing to keep this other stuff from coming out. I just wanted to let you guys know, and I'm severely disappointed.